As she continued her journey, Much Afraid learned many more lessons. Each time she had to lay aside what she wanted to do and decide instead to do what the shepherd wanted. After each lesson, another stone was added to the little bag that she carried with her. Her feet were still twisted, but Much Afraid was hardly limping. Little by little, she was changing. Her helpers seemed different too. They still held her hands, but she didn't feel any sorrow or suffering in their touch. They were becoming even better friends, and often they walked along. All three of them sang songs from the shepherd's great book. Then came the hardest test of all. One day the path led them to a great and rocky hole. They stood carefully at the ledge and peered into it. They saw nothing but darkness. It was impossible to know how deep it was or how wide. The only sound was that of rushing waters, and Much Afraid realized that they must be near a great waterfall. She looked at Sorrow and Suffering and asked, "What is this place? Do you know where we are?" They answered softly, "This is the Canyon of Full Surrender." Much Afraid trembled and repeated their answer, "Full surrender." She understood immediately what that meant. She was to give up everything. She was to be willing to lay down even the shepherd's promises. She must be willing to never receive her new name, never to have Hinds Feet. Suddenly, the words of bitterness came to her mind. What does he think he's doing? After all you've been through, still he always has something worse ahead. Kneeling down at the edge of the canyon, she reached and took out the little bag of stones. She emptied them into her lap and looked at them. Should I throw them away? She asked herself. Aren't they all just empty promises? Do they really mean anything? One by one, she picked up the stones. Remembering each lesson and each time how she laid down her own desires for his. No, I can't throw them away, she thought. Even if he leads me into the canyon of full surrender, I will trust him. She put them carefully back into the little bag and stood up. Sorrow and Suffering had been sitting quietly, watching her. Now they stood too and laughed with relief. Much Afraid turned to them. What should we do? She asked. Can we jump across to the other side? No, they said. That would be impossible. Then what are we to do? She asked. We must leap down into the canyon, was their answer. Of course, said Much Afraid. We must leap down into the canyon. Then, for the first time on that journey, though she didn't know it at the time, she held out her hands to Sorrow and Suffering. She was weak and very tired, so instead of taking her hands, they moved closer and put their hands under her arms so that she could lean on them. Then Much Afraid jumped into the dark canyon of full surrender. The canyon was deep, and she had landed on the ground alone. She might have been hurt quite badly, but her friends were there so that she was strong, and Much Afraid was a little bruised and shaken, and that was it. The canyon was quite dark and filled with fog, so they couldn't see anything at first. They stepped forward, carefully feeling their way through the darkness. They came to a large rock that seemed to be some sort of altar. Much Afraid spoke quietly. This is the place. This is where I am to make an offering. The waterfall they had heard from the head of the canyon was roaring mighty beside them. They stood in the cool shadows at the foot of the cliffs, letting the spray touch their faces. Much Afraid listened to the thundering waters, and it sounded to her like a whole orchestra playing a familiar song. Suddenly, she realized it was the same music she had heard from the little river in the valley that she had come from so long ago. Come, come, oh, let us away and lower, lower every day. From the heights we leap and flow to the valleys down below, always answering to the call to the lowest place of all. Much Afraid watched through the dim light as the water joyfully leaped over the lip of the falls and shouted out its song. It looks as though the waters think it is the loveliest thing in the world to be poured out like this, she said. She turned quietly to the stone altar. This time, instead of just laying down her own desires, Much Afraid laid her whole self on that altar. She gave her crooked feet, her twisted mouth, and her fearing heart. She gave all her hopes and dreams of ever getting to the high places. She gave all that she was and all that she would ever be. There came a flame from somewhere that seemed to burn deep within her heart. A beautiful sense of peace filled her as she fell asleep. And that's where we're going to stop.